everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about the methodology of intertexture. This is the idea that written words are influenced by worlds of older texts and stories. Authors weave these older texts into the fabric of what they're creating. Sometimes they are fully aware that they're doing it, and they'll indicate it by saying that they're going to use a quotation. Other times they may not recognize it at all. Regardless of whether or not they're aware of it, works are birthed by the traditions and experiences of the author as they incorporate them into new text. This is called intertexture. In an article written for the Introduction to Biblical Criticisms and Their Applications, Patricia Tull writes that all new texts are formed from the building blocks of other texts. She includes the list to incorporate the use of previously learned words, to restating of information, and direct quoting, including a citation of other books. It's an inseparability from associations with other texts, and it refers to the interconnections among those texts. So now that we have our definition, we can discuss intertextuality as an exegetical skill. According to Stephen Alkier, intertextuality as a method of exegesis involves the task of investigating the relationships that a text can have with other texts. He further states that it's an inescapable aspect of biblical studies. As an investigation, it concerns itself with the effects of meaning that emerge from the references of a given text to other texts. However, it's not the only perspective from which text should be investigated. Now that we know what it is and how to use it as an exegetical skill, how can we identify an author's usage of intertextuality? Because of the varying levels of self-consciousness in which authors employ this methodology, it can sometimes be difficult to ascertain the author's intention in writing the passages. But specifically looking at the New Testament, one can identify several ways that the New Testament interacts or overlaps with the Old Testament in varying states of dependence. Green outlines 4 of these. The first one is a direct citation. This method is typically used with a kind of introductory formula. It signals the reader to an upcoming quotation. For example, the phrase, "as it is written," is used throughout the New Testament in numerous locations to signal the reader back to the Old Testament. The second one is seen in the way the New Testament writers use phrases and summaries of the Old Testament teachings. A problem with this is that if one had no prior knowledge of the collection of texts that we now know as the Old Testament, then these references may go entirely unnoticed. The third example of intertextuality is the use of type scenes. This is when there's a sense of repetition in the narrative. They're recurring themes. Fourth, the New Testament alludes to the Old Testament. These two could go unnoticed to the unassuming reader, as they require no direct quotation to signal them, but they're only seen as the newer writings echo the older ones. When specifically talking about this method in reference to the Bible, it's important to note that for the 1st and 2nd century church, the selection of documents known as the New Testament didn't exist. Therefore, the group of documents and writings now known as the Old Testament was not so named, but it wasn't viewed as an incomplete selection of documents, but for New Testament writers, their theological argumentation proceeded from the understanding that the Old Testament was an authority. So now let's apply the method. Let's look at how intertextuality plays out in the New Testament book of James. Steeped in Jewish wisdom literature, James pushes his readers to interpret one text by referencing another. Perhaps one of the strongest features of the book is the way that James intermingles his language and teachings with other works of his day. Specifically, this includes his usage of Old Testament text and vocabulary, as well as the parallels between his teachings and those of Jesus that can be found in the Gospel of Matthew. Throughout the book, James uses the Old Testament in a couple of characteristic ways. First, the majority of his quotations and allusions are taken from the Greek Old Testament, or LXX. And second, James's themes resonate with the wisdom literature of the Old Testament as well as other non-canonical Jewish literature of the day. It shares vocabulary and concepts with Proverbs as well as a collection of ethical literature that was written by a Jewish scribe. It's called the Book of Sirach, or sometimes it's called Ecclesiasticus. The epistle closely resembles Proverbs in its language and its succinct phrases. Like Proverbs, it focuses on the practical aspect of living for God and encourages God's people to act like God's people. Whether or not James was intentional in his mirroring of Jewish wisdom literature, or whether he was simply influenced by the church's common heritage concerning teachings and preachings that he grew up on, we have no real way of ascertaining. But one of the questions you must ask yourself when evaluating a passage is, which textual relationships should be noted and how should they be investigated? For the purpose of this discussion, I have only looked at the intertextual relationships between the Old and New Testaments. So what Old Testament text does James cite or allude to? I've included a table for you to look at while I talk. The author seems to draw his inspiration from the book of Proverbs. The following chart illustrates the corresponding passages. In James, you see this idea that one should be slow to anger. This is mirrored in the book of Proverbs, where it also talks about being slow to anger. Likewise, you see treatment of the poor, speech resembling a fire, being proud versus being humble, and not knowing about tomorrow. While James doesn't precisely quote Proverbs, they greatly mimic the structure and vocabulary used in that book. The context of that book was to instruct believers on righteous living through a collection of wise sayings. James likewise instructs his audience through wise sayings, in a manner that nods back to the Old Testament wisdom sayings. In this way, James is acknowledging the setting and intent of the author and incorporating his message into his own. Because of the intertextual connection of the canon, it's possible to read and interpret every biblical writing in light of every other biblical writing. A major pro of reading the Bible this way is that it produces possibilities of reading an unlimited number of combinations and effects of meaning. However, closely following this positive aspect is its own negative response, namely that because of the myriad possibilities of meanings, the shared information is never fully shared. Different people can assign to it different meanings based on the lenses through which they read the text. Overall, it's most important to view this method as a reading strategy. It provides an insight on the nature of biblical texts rather than producing a formula that outlines a specific procedure for producing interpretation. Overall, it is most important to view this method as a reading strategy that provides insight on the nature of biblical texts, rather than viewing it as a formula for outlining a specific procedure for producing interpretation. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation on intertextuality, and I hope that it educated you a little on what it was all about. Thanks.